thought were friends, once he ran out of the money, once he ran out of the good times, once he fell in hard times, they weren't around anymore. The garage was empty. The car had been repossessed. I mean, this guy was facing some tough times. And then to make matters worse, how the story goes, it says that famine hit the land. In other words, the economy crashes. They hit recession. He's got no job, no money, no course of action. And so here he is. He's desperate. Man, what am I going to do? And so he does the only thing he knows to do in that moment. He finds that the only job he can get, which is working in a pig stall, which, again, especially for a Jewish kid, that was about as low as it got. I mean, to work in an unkosher, environment like that, working with the pigs, working in the squalor, working in the mud, and it gets to such a bad point. He gets so desperate, even the food that he's feeding the pigs for this job starts to actually look good to him. I mean, this is how desperate he's getting. And in fact, to the point where he starts to contemplate, man, what would it look like if I actually returned home? Well, what could it look like if I went back home and asked my dad for forgiveness? And surely I know he couldn't forgive me and restore me back to the place I once was when I left, but maybe he would take me back on as a hired servant. Maybe he would take me back on as an employee. And so he starts to kind of come up with this apology. And again, talking about a bad situation. Because here's the thing, is that here's what he would have known by going back, and I think this really speaks to the desperation of the situation he was in, is that going back home really meant one of two things. It meant either the possibility of death, of being stoned to death from his family, and actually they had every right. I mean, considering what this kid said to his dad, taking the inheritance, putting their lifeline, their life economy, at risk, and everything they had at risk, the shame that he would have brought upon the family. They had every right in that culture to stone him to death. But the other option, if they didn't stone him to death, was a tradition in Jewish, in kind of the Jewish circles, which was this ceremony known as the kazah, which is where they would take these jars. If a kid kind of that came from a similar type of situation kind of came back home, what the elders of the town would do is they would take these jars of kind of this burnt corn, and then they would take it and they would run up to him, and then they would take this jar full of these burnt corn pieces, and they would smash it at his feet and say, "You're cut off from your people. You're dead to us." And it would just be one person after the next, just smashing, saying, "You're dead to us. You're cut off from us." Public shaming, right? These were his options, which talk about, a bad situation when these are looking like good options to you. Like, well, hey, public shaming or death is better than eating the pig slop, right? I mean, that's the point he had gotten to. And so he goes back, and this is sort of his Hail Mary attempt at saving his life, at redeeming his life, at getting his life back. And so he goes back, and the whole time you can just imagine he's rehearsing, what he's going to say to his dad. How can he make this sound even remotely good at all? And so this is kind of where we catch him. He's walking back home, and this is where I love where the story turns. And it's in verse 20. It says, when he was still a long way off, his father saw him, his heart pounding. He ran to him. He embraced him. He kissed him. And the son started his speech, "Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son ever again." Now, again, this crowd, if they weren't already appalled by how the story started, they would have been aghast at how it was going right now. Because it was shameful. For a Middle Eastern guy, like in his 50s, to run for anything, by the way, that was like total shame. I mean, if you were, had any wealth at all, any reputation at all, you had people that would do that for you. Like, go get the remote control. Go get the, groceries. I mean, you didn't have to do that. But again, remember back to the options that his son was facing. Death, public shaming. See, I used to always think that the father, the reason he ran to his son was because he just missed hanging out with his son. He was just so happy to see his son return home. But what I've come to discover is that the reason he was running to his son is because he knew what awaited his son if he didn't get there first. If he didn't get there first, his son faced assured public shaming, potentially even death. And I love it because isn't that a picture of what the gospel's all about? That is the gospel. That's a story of a God who doesn't run from you. Isn't, when he looks at your sin, looks at your mistakes, looks at your issues, isn't like turning his back and saying, you're dead to me, I'm done with you. But a God who's gazing, who's looking out after you and is willing to leave the comforts of heaven to chase after you, to pursue you, to go all the way to the point of a cross, to take a shame that you and I deserve to take, a death and pay a price that you and I deserve to face. That's the gospel message. And that's what we see in this story. And yet, as amazing as that is, the story, there's almost kind of this cliffhanger part right here. So the father, he returns, he embraces that, and that would have been shocking. But there's an interesting portion right here. And this is in verse 22. It says, but the father wasn't listening. So here he's got all of his excuses. He's got his story down. He's rehearsed it. And he's getting ready to make this great speech. Dad, I'm so sorry. I made so many mistakes. I'm sorry for sinning against you. I'm sorry for sinning against God. And yet, what does the dad do? He doesn't listen to it. It turns around. And again, go back to remember the audience that was there. Again, you got a group of those that were labeled the sinners, labeled as the outsiders, which really all of us are that, and then you got the religious folk, those who acted like they had it all together, had it all figured out. And for them, your relationship with God, it was all about somehow proving your self-worth. Somehow it was all about the law. There wasn't anything about grace. It was all about what you did and how you obeyed all these 600 some laws and how you measured up in the light of that. And so there's that moment where in this story where it says the father, he wasn't listening. And you can just imagine the religious in the crowd like, see, I told you. See, like, this is now starting to make sense to us. Like justice is coming. Like you guys thought you could just sleep around. You guys thought you could just, drink however much you wanted to drink. You could live the life. You could party it up. You could ignore God with your whole life. And see, I told you, you can't just do that. You can't just live your life any old way and expect God to take you back. He's not listening to you. And listen, for some of us, that's how we believe. That's when we think of God. That's one of our big struggles. Maybe at one point in time you tried taking a step towards God, and you surrendered your life. And maybe in that moment you didn't feel anything. Nothing seemed to change. Nothing seemed to change in that moment in your life. Maybe the next day or the day after that, and you mistook God's silence as God's anger for you. That somehow you mistook God's silence as saying, listen, I couldn't accept you. I can't receive you. I can't love you with all the stuff you did, all the things you did. You're dead to me, right? But listen what the father does. It said the father wasn't listening, but look what he does next. It says he was calling to the servants, quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then get a grain-fed heifer and roast it. In other words, order out to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. We're going to have one amazing party, right? And we're going to have a wonderful time. My son's here, given up for dead and now alive, given up lost and is now found. See, what if what we mistake as God's silence because he's mad at us isn't because he's mad at all, but because he's making preparations for us. He's getting things lined up. He's setting the stage for this party, this celebration. He's starting to work behind the scenes. And in fact, just to kind of, it's one thing to kind of tell you about this, but there's kind of a great video clip that I think kind of helps illustrate this and maybe kind of help us get a little bit of a picture of kind of what's really happening here in this story. Why don't you take a look?
Hey, Dad. It's me. Man, I know it's been a long time since we talked. I was kind of hoping you'd answer, but I understand that you probably don't want to talk to me. I've just gone so far, and the things I've done, I just regret it, you know? And I know how bad I've hurt you and let you down, but Dad, I miss you. I miss how we drive around and just talk about life. And I just want to come home. But I know you've probably written me off. I can't blame you, actually. Here's the thing. It's kind of a shot in the dark, but I'm coming through town soon, and I'd really just like to see you. I know I can't just show up at the front door like I used to, but if you want to see me, just hang a small sheet out on the porch. And if the sheet isn't there when I drive by, I'll keep going, and I'll try not to bother you anymore. I love you, Dad.
That's the story of our God who looks at you. And again, when we're talking about this ideal family, it's not an invitation for those that look picture perfect, who have it all together, who have it all figured out. In fact, truthfully, the perfection of his love shines most in our imperfections, in all of our failures and all of our mistakes, that even with all that we've done, no matter how far down the road you go, no matter the depths you've fallen, we have a God who's waiting for you, not with his back turned. Not saying you're dead to me, not saying, hey, when you get your stuff all figured out, when you come up with a good enough excuse. No, he said, arms wide open. Saying, if you'll just come to me in all your brokenness and all your issues, in just the way you are. Listen, I see you not defined by your failure, not defined by your mistake, but I see you as the son, the daughter, the child of God that I created you to be from the first place. And so that's kind of the story. That's the story of the gospel. But and normally when I preach this story, this is kind of where I just sort of end it. Because it's an amazing picture of his grace and his mercy and the extent that he's willing to go for you and for me, and his love, and really this picture of really a kingdom family, a family that no matter, again, how far you fall, no matter how far you run, listen, he's always there. His grace, you can't, outfail or outfall his love and his grace and his mercy for you. But what's interesting about this story is that Jesus doesn't stop the story right there. In fact, he continues on, and it's interesting in verse 22, kind of how he continues on this story. And I think it's really important for us to get this because it's one thing to come to him, experience his grace, to experience salvation. But listen, you got to understand, God has more for you than just that. More than just, punching your ticket to heaven, more than just punching your ticket into the family. God actually has more for your life than simply that. And we start to kind of see this in verse 22, and we see the process of how he does this. He says he called to the servants. He called to the servants. He said, quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then you'll get the roast and the cow, and we're going to roast it. We're going to have an amazing feast. See, what you got to get here is that, too, in a little background of the culture here, servants there wasn't, oftentimes in Jewish families, servants, they weren't there because they had to be. It wasn't like slavery, forced slavery. In many cases, they were there because they chose to be. And they chose to be, and they would make these lifetime commitments. They were a part of the family. They became like members of the family. And so it's interesting here, and here's what I want you to get, is that while the Father redeems his children, it's the family that restores them. Well, the Father redeems his children, it's the family that restores them. Notice in this picture who God actually delegates the restoration process to. People. People is the family of God, believers. He delegates this to his family, the work of restoration. In fact, I put in my notes this way: redemption is a result of a relationship with God, but restoration is the result of a relationship with God's people. See, what you got to understand is that the story, while it's an amazing story of grace, the son coming home and he gets embraced, the story was never meant to stop there, and it's not meant to just stop there in your life either. So often people come and they might make a decision, surrender their life to Christ and take that step into God's family, but they don't go any farther. And yet you got to understand, God's call, part of the gospel message is not just this promise of eternal life, but abundant life. And the only way we step into that is not just through redemption, which he does, and he does it simply on his own, the finished work on the cross, but also through this process of restoration, which he delegates to his people. And it leads to this question: do you have some people in your life that are leading to this restoration process? That are helping you take the next step to step into the abundant life that God has for you? Because, again, think about it. How loving would it have been if the father just simply left his son, greeted him, turned and kind of walked in the house and just, left him in all of his dirt and all of his gunk and all of his issues, but didn't actually do anything to help kind of clean him up. Do anything to kind of help him, take some next steps and actually step into, again, who he was created to be, step back into his true identity as a son, as a child of the family. In fact, there's a quick story I just want to touch on that kind of speaks to this too. It's a story in John chapter 11 where it's, again, one of the more famous stories of kind of Jesus' miraculous works, I guess. And there's this moment where Lazarus, one of his close friends, ends up dying. And 3 days he's stuck in a tomb. And of course that was, I think kind of an important little detail because, again, in Jewish mindset, Jewish culture, they believed that 3 days, as long as a body was in a tomb, oftentimes they would keep these funerals going for about 3 days' time because they still believed that the soul of the person was like right around the corpse of the body during those first 3 days. So in other words, they still felt there was a chance, like 3 days, still a chance he could come back to life. But the fourth day, it was done. It was over. Well, Jesus shows up on the fourth day, and he comes and he, he shows up and it's amazing because he calls Lazarus out. It's this amazing miracle. And in fact, we read about it in John 11, 43, 44. It says, when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to him, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Now, again, Jesus has just raised this guy from the dead. Like, don't you think that he could have, not just, raised him from the dead? So imagine, here's this corpse. He's still got the linens around him. He's smelly. He stinks. It looks like a scene from, I don't know, one of the, zombie shows out there and stuff. I mean, this is, a scary scene. Like, you sit there and think, if he raised him from the dead, couldn't he have just also, like, given him a bath in the process, too? Like, cleaned his hair? Like, he could have come out of the tomb looking like James Bond, shaken but not stirred. I mean, he could have, but he didn't. He says he delegated. They said to them, again, people are part of the process. He said, take off the grave clothes and let him go. So I wonder for some of us, how many of us have maybe made that decision? We've surrendered our life to Christ, and yet we don't feel like there's been any change, there's been any transformation in our life. And could it be because we've never taken that next step? We've never entered into the process of restoration, which requires people in our lives, requires community in our lives, requires us being a part of the family of God, right? And specifically, just real quickly, there's kind of just three things, kind of start to wrap up here with this, is that three things of kind of